This is TrojanVision One-on-One. Today's featured guest, novelist and Hall Waters Prize recipient Michelle Richmond.
Welcome, my name is James Fussell. I'm a student at Troy University as part of the English department. And on behalf of the department today, I want to welcome Michelle Richmond, recipient of the Hall Waters Prize. And today we're going to interview her with three students, Kara Brown, Natalie Hatfield, and A.F. Mixon.
Hi Michelle, and welcome to Troy University. On behalf of the English department, we'd just like to ask you some questions about your career and your novels that have come from that.
Okay, thank you, Kara.
Good to have you. So some different novels that you've written have been categorized in different genres, such as literary fiction. One reviewer described Know When You Know as young adult fiction, and now you're doing mystery and thrillers. How would you classify yourself, and do you feel like these categories impose a divide sometimes between literary and popular reading?
Mm-hmm. Well, I used to really sort of reject the genre classifications because I felt like it was too small a box, but I've come to understand that that's how that's how bookstores know where to categorize a book, right. And that's how the readers know how to find you. It's a little confusing though when a writer like me, because I write in different genres, so it can get a little confusing. Oh, is this a thriller writer? Is this a literary fiction writer? And I just always write the book I want to write, and I feel like the writing, sort of the what I pay attention to in the writing is always the same, but depending on what genre, I might tweak things up a little bit. So in a thriller, you have to move more quickly, and you can't have as many of those slow meditative passages. If I know the book is going to be marketed as sort of a more literary book, you get a little more leisure in the pacing. Okay. But basically I just write the book and then the editor runs with it.
Right,
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So how would you describe your writing style, and how did you learn to develop it?
I'm tempted to make a joke about how disorganized my writing habits are, but I think I think over time my style has become a lot more direct. So in the beginning, I really loved writing these long, sort of flowing sentences that went here and there. And I think as I got older and did more books, I came to appreciate more direct writing and sort of clearer, simpler sentences. But a lot of it has to do with what I'm reading at the time. So, and no matter whether you think you're being influenced by something or you think you're not being influenced by it, I think if you're really immersing yourself in a particular author or genre, that sort of informs what you're writing at that time.
So, in your novel Golden State, the entirety of the novel actually centers around Californians and their decision to vote or not to vote. To secede from the United States. Are you actually interested in politics, and did that shape your decision to write this novel, or did that affect the plot in any way? Or?
Yes. So I'm very interested in politics, and what happened with that's the only book I've written that has very political undertones, and it's kind of there's sort of there's a suspense aspect to it, but I started writing that book, Golden State, when there was all this sort of talk of secession, of California seceding from the Union, and when I submitted it to my publisher, they said, "Oh, well, this is kind of where this is science fiction." I said, "This is not science fiction. This is like just around the bend." And right before the book came out, the secession movement grew, and there was an actual initiative on the ballot to split not to secede, but to split California into 6 states. So I was able to talk to my publisher in New York and say, "See, it wasn't science fiction. Anything can happen in California."
Okay. So we touched on this question a little bit earlier with today's Q&A. But how, with publishing and how much it has changed over the past 20 years since you started your career, how would you say that the rise of social media has affected your sense of audience and your relationship to it? Or would you say that that has had any effect at all?
Well, so I'll start with the positive aspects of social media, and that is that I can very easily have a conversation with a reader who reaches out to me on Twitter, and I can also, if there's an author I like, I can just follow them, and there are many writers who who I've never met in person, who I have almost daily conversations with on Twitter, and we all just sort of support each other, but you also see who has a new book coming out. Right. So I enjoy that aspect of it. The other thing I like about it is finding, sort of going down the rabbit hole and finding an article I want to read, and then going, going deeper and deeper into a subject. But, I mean, there's definitely a negative aspect to social media, and there can be, you can see anybody's angry opinion, but of your books. Right. That I don't think that really affects me very much, but I do think that Twitter and Facebook, although I rarely use Facebook, but I still have a Facebook professional page, and I still notice that if you announce something on Facebook, that's how people hear about it. So I do think it's easier for people to, or either that's how people my age, I don't think any of you are on Facebook, but that's how people my age still hear about things. And also, oddly enough, I've discovered people discover books through Pinterest, and they buy books through Pinterest, and I'm sure there are many others that I don't know about. But I think it allows you to have a closer relationship with readers, and it's easier for people to reach out to you, so that's good.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you recently spent 2 years in Paris, which is going to be a setting in your memoir and in your novel that you're having coming up. How would you say that living outside of the U.S. affected your writing?
Well, I think first of all, it made me start work on a brand new project outside of what I was working on. It probably slowed down my progression a little bit because, it slowed down sort of the publishing pace just because I became really immersed in this sort of memoir and essays that I'm writing, and took a back seat from, the novel on contract, which is always a danger of, stepping away from what you're supposed to be writing. But I think, I've always written a lot about other countries just when I've been traveling to them, and so I think for me it opened up living in Paris allows you to travel all over Europe very quickly, very inexpensively, and so in that way it opened my writing up to a lot of new places, and every new place I went to I felt inspired and sort of wrote more than I might have if I had just stayed at home.
Building off of that question, you moved to Paris, I'm not going to say at an unfortunate time, but I'll say an interesting time.
An unfortunate time, it was.
The pandemic was, I'm sure, different there, at least a little bit. Yeah. Do you think your experiences writing in places like Beijing and Paris would have been different had you lived there at a different time or experienced a different lifestyle in those places?
Yes, I think it would have. Because whatever you're going through at your life in any given moment, whether you want it to or not, influences the tone of your writing, it influences what you write about, it influences your work habit. And prior to the pandemic, we had a year of fairly violent unrest in Paris. And so that introduced this element of anxiety that I hadn't expected to feel quite so intensely as I did while we were there. So I definitely think that made its way into my writing, and I look at some of the things I wrote in the beginning, and this is not the Paris that people want to visit and eat the croissants, which that exists, but it's sort of a different side of that world. And as for Beijing, I think my experience there was just informed by being young, alone, I was followed a lot, which was an interesting experience, but more concerningly, people who talked to me we would be interrupted by police because they were talking to me. So I think all of that sort of found its way into what I was later writing, sort of about the surveillance state, which has come up in several of my stories and novels.
Okay. So when you are writing, I know this is, some authors prefer to have an outline that they work from or to just jump straight in. What would you say is your preference?
I
Do you just
never
jump
do an
in?
outline, no, yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. Is that the end of your question? I absolutely cannot outline it. I teach a class on novel writing in which I do a lesson on sort of plotting ahead and outlining, and I always tell them, this might work for you, but I'm not telling you this from practice because I don't do that. So when I start a novel, I know who it is, I know where they live, what they do for a living, and I know sort of the time scale of the novel. So I know if like Golden State is going to happen in one day, Year of Fog is going to happen in 1 year, although it wasn't called Year of Fog at that time. The Wonder Test, I knew it was basically 1 semester. So that's what I know. And I also know what's the big problem that the character faces. But Year of Fog opens with a girl who goes missing on the beach. I didn't know until very late in the writing of the novel, will the girl be found or not? Right. I was still figuring that out at the end. So I just sort of discovered as I go, which makes it very slow. That's why I'm such a slow writer, because I don't plan it out ahead, but that's what works for me.
Okay.
Can you explain to us the roles of an editor and an agent in the writing process, and how does that actually affect your writing style?
Okay. So your agent is your business partner, and if you're lucky, your friend. Your agent, once you get an agent, the agent decides if your book is ready to send out, and then who they're going to send it to. Your agent has relationships with editors all over New York City, and now in other places as well. And your agent goes to lunches with these editors and says, I have a novel I think you should read. And so your agent is the one who sells your book. She gets, or they get a 15% commission on everything, and that is the best money you will ever spend is your agent's commission, because you can't do that you can publish without an agent, but it's a different world. So your agent does all this. Your agent also does foreign rights, which is a big part of it that you might not know about when you're first going into writing, but the foreign rights are a big part of how you make your living as a writer. Your agent does film rights, and you may also have a film agent in addition to the literary agent. So that's what the agent does, and the agent holds your hand and says, it's all going to be okay, we're going to sell this. Sit back and I'll send you the checks eventually, you just have to trust me. So what the editor does is you have acquisitions editors who work for the publishing houses. And the acquisitions editors, they acquire you and they acquire your book. And hopefully they're acquiring both. So they might just find this one book that your agent has sent them and they say, we're going to publish this book. Or they might say, okay, yes, we want this book, but in order to take this book, you have to also promise us your next book, which is a 2-book contract. So the editor acquires your book and then they work with you to get it ready for publication. And that's who holds your hand until publication day, and hopefully for a few minutes afterwards while you're stressing. But so the editor does a lot of nuts and bolts work on the book itself, but your editor also advocates for your book within the publishing house and tells the house why that should be a big book, or how they should market it, or why they should pay attention to it, and why they should publish it if there are people in marketing, which is also a part of the company who can decide not to, if marketing doesn't like your book in a big publishing house, that's a problem. So the editor is also selling your book to the marketing department.
Okay, so you mentioned to Kara how you don't really outline, you just kind of come up with the story, but you did specifically mention how before you start writing, you've already got ideas like how long it's going to take in the story, like the setting, information about the character, even very minute details like their career. And earlier today, you also mentioned that many of your characters are based on people that you meet in real life or you are friends with. So, would you say that you come up with these original characters and then base an idea around them and build the story, or do you have this idea in your head of what you want to write, and when you find someone that you feel fits the plot, you kind of plug them in?
Well, so usually I have an idea of sort of what the story is. So like with the marriage pact, the idea was, okay, this couple is going to get a present for their wedding, and the present is going to be invitation to join this exclusive club called the Marriage Pact. And so I had this idea, then I thought, okay, who's going to tell the story? So I'd written all of my previous books. The narrator had been written from the female perspective. So I thought, okay, these two people are going to launch this story, and we're going to stay with them for a long period of time, and I want to challenge myself and try something different. So who's going to tell the story? So I decided it was going to be Jake, and then I had to decide, okay, what should he do to, what should his career be? And I thought, oh, okay, if he's a counselor and a marriage therapist, that fits into the story. Now with Jake, I didn't actually have a specific person from my life in mind, and with Alice, who's the other main character in the story, I also didn't have a person in mind from my life. But so I'm trying to just sort of think back to my books, and I actually think it's more with minor characters that there's someone that I know who makes their way in, and sometimes these are just like little gifts or teases to friends or acquaintances where their name will be in the book, and or something sort of about them will be in the book. There are lots of books that have there are lots of FBI agents in the books, just their names over the past 20 years, just because as a fun thing to drop these people into the books. But so I never really plug up. If I plug a person in, it's more just plugging in their name to a minor character. Mm-hmm. And the major characters I'm more sort of fully developed, although I would say that a few of them have started with composites of people with whom I was involved, or friends. Definitely my first novel, Dream of the Blue Room, had actual friends from childhood in it. Sorry, that was a very long answer. I'm not sure I fully answered your question with my long answer. But
So you were just talking about the marriage pact, and that actually leads right into the next question that we had. So you have those novels, both the Marriage Pact and the Wonder Test, seem to have kind of a satirical edge to them, and make fun of like the traditional marriage guidance programs and also standardized tests. And then you also talk about Silicon Valley. So what made those topics like attractive to you to use in your books?
Well, I think with the Wonder Test and testing like high stakes education culture, that just came from living in Northern California in the Bay Area, very close to Silicon Valley, and it came just from the experience of being a parent in the public schools there. And so, but also just sort of like there are so many wonderful things about where I live, but there's also a lot of things that are ripe for further examination. And I think with the Wonder Test, that's what I was thinking about. But I was really thinking about all the pressure on kids to perform well for the sake of their parents, and for the sake of their parents' sort of sense of self-worth, and then in the book for the community as a whole, and its affluence requires the students to perform well. And then with the Marriage Pact, I think I was just interested in looking at this institution that is so such a big part of so many cultures for such a long time. And I wanted to think about, okay, what really makes a marriage work? And if you had rules to follow, would that make your marriage better? Like if we went into it with more information and somebody was saying, no, you have to do this, this, and this, could you have a happier marriage that way? So it was just kind of I take an idea, and then I just try to figure out how can you sort of pull that idea apart and see what's underneath it.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Considering that all of your books are relatively different from each other in the way that they are written and what their genres are about, would you say that you do have a writing process or like a daily writing process? And if so, like how has that evolved over the years?
I recommend that everyone have a daily writing process, and I do not. I blame Netflix. I blame having a teenager. But obviously it's on me. Some days I write and some days I don't. Actually, what I tell my students is, like, a lot of people say, write every day, write every day, write every day. You don't have to write every day. Writing is my job, so I have more leisure to write every day than most people. But, and I don't think you should only write when you're inspired, but there will be days when you need to live something to have something to write about. Mm-hmm. So what I do try to do is I write in the mornings, so that's several days a week, and I try to write before anyone else in the house gets up. I drink loads of coffee, massive quantities of coffee. I wrote a whole book about coffee, novel about coffee called, I think that was No One You Know. And so it's coffee, early mornings. I never write at night. I sort of write what I feel like writing that day until I get to the editing process. But otherwise, I might sit down and write a scene from the end of the novel or the middle of the novel, or a scene that I have no idea if it works in the novel. And later, when I have lots and lots of pages, I figure out how it all goes together.
So, with that being said, do you think that that's a challenge for you, or does it just work for you? And it might not work for everyone, but...
Yeah, I think it definitely doesn't work for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a challenge for me, but it's a challenge created by myself. Like, there are some times when I have more discipline than others. So I used to go away for, when I had a regular teaching schedule and did not have a child yet, I used to go away for a month every summer to a writer's colony. A writer's colony, you go, you don't spend any money, they feed you, they give you somewhere to live, they give you a writing studio, and you just write. And so in those circumstances, I could get up at 7 and write until dinner time at 6 and go all the way through. But now I don't have the leisure to do that, but sometimes I give myself retreats. Like, I'll go stay at a motel somewhere for 3 days and just write all day. But yeah, so I think having, like, I have friends who have a habit of writing from 8 to noon, and I think that's a very positive habit. That's not something I've ever developed, but I think that definitely is probably the better way to go. But I think I found what works for me.
Right. Okay. So we also talked about this a little bit earlier. Your time writing short stories as well, short fiction. So would you say that, like you were just talking about your early morning hours of writing, is that when a lot of your short stories come about, just from you starting writing and having something that basically just makes itself happen? Or is that something that you usually reserve for other times and you focus on your novels in the mornings?
The stories can happen at any time. I mean, a lot of times, actually, a story sort of starts if I'm just sitting down reading, and I'll just be reading, and I'll think of something, and so I'll put my book aside that I'm reading and just start writing. Always when I'm traveling. I always write when I'm traveling, and a lot of times that takes the form of very short memoir pieces or is the beginning of a story. Oftentimes, something will just happen in the world, and that is a click. And so when I have this idea of usually a story is a sentence, and then I write the next sentence, and the next sentence I think, oh, okay, this can be a story, and then I just keep writing it until I'm done, which is what I love about stories. You can keep writing until you're done and be done in 2 weeks, whereas with a novel, 2-3 years.
Right, makes sense. Well, thank you so much for answering our questions.
Kara, Natalie, and
It's
Aya.
been
So nice
to meet
talk to
you
you all.
and talk to you and just hear some advice from you. So,
Well, thank you. You all had great questions. This was fun.
thank you.